The lantern light was already in his hand when he pushed open the barn door, and what he saw stopped him cold. She was curled against the hay bales in the far corner, a threadbare wool blanket pulled over her shoulders, her dark hair fanned out beneath her like spilled ink. She was sleeping so deeply, so completely, that she did not hear the creak of the hinges or the soft thud of his boots on the earthen floor. One of her hands was tucked beneath her cheek. The other was wrapped around the handle of a small folding knife, even in sleep refusing to let go of the only protection she had. Holt Oren stood there for a long moment, the lantern casting a warm amber glow across the straw, and the sleeping woman and the dried blood at her temple that she had not quite managed to clean away. He had lived on this land for 11 years. He had buried his father here, buried 2 horses here, weathered 2 droughts and a flood, and learned through every one of those trials that the world outside the fence line of his ranch was a place of cruel and indifferent forces. He was not a man who was easily surprised, but this surprised him. He stepped closer slowly, and the lantern light shifted, and he saw the bruising along her jaw. He saw the torn seam at the shoulder of her dress. He saw the way even in sleep her brow was furrowed, as if whatever she was running from had followed her into her dreams. He crouched down beside her and his jaw tightened. He had a choice to make. He could wake her now, tell her she was trespassing, send her back out into the dark Wyoming night where the temperature had already dropped below freezing. He could do the practical thing, the expected thing. The thing that a man with 160 acres to protect and no time for complications would do. He set the lantern down on a wooden post and sat back on his heels and looked at her for another long moment. Then he stood up, walked back to the barn entrance and shut the door firmly against the howling wind outside. He went back to the house, up to the linen chest in the hallway, and pulled out his heaviest spare blanket. He brought it back to the barn and laid it over her without waking her. And then he sat down on the overturned feed bucket near the door and crossed his arms over his chest and waited for the morning. Because one thing was already decided in his mind before she ever opened her eyes. She was not going back out there. He did not yet know her name. He did not know what she was running from or how she had ended up in a barn in the middle of Wyoming in the early weeks of October, 1882. He did not know that she would change his life completely, or that she carried a secret so dangerous it would bring armed men to his door before the week was out. He only knew that she was hurt and alone and sleeping in his barn. And that was enough. 3 days before that cold October night, Vivienne Pace had been sitting at the window of a boarding house room in Cheyenne, watching the rain come down in gray curtains over the city streets, and trying to decide how much trouble she was actually in. The answer, which she had been resisting for some time, was considerable. Vivienne was 26 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years working as a bookkeeper and records clerk for a man named Franklin Druce, who operated a freight hauling company out of Cheyenne. The work had been steady, the pay decent, and Vivienne had been grateful for it when she first arrived in Wyoming with nothing but a carpetbag and the address of a cousin who had already moved on by the time she got there. She was educated, she was meticulous, and she understood numbers the way some people understood landscapes, seeing patterns in them immediately and intuitively. Druce had hired her because she was competent and because he believed, incorrectly, that a woman bookkeeper would ask fewer questions than a man. She had asked very few questions, it was true, but she had noticed things. Over the course of 2 years, working late evenings in the back office while Druce entertained clients in the front room, she had begun to notice that the numbers in the public ledgers did not match the numbers in the private ones. She had noticed that certain freight shipments were recorded twice, under different names, with different destinations. She had noticed that a man whose name appeared regularly in the private ledger, a man named Senator Corbin Aldgate, seemed to receive a great deal of freight that was never listed on any public manifest. She had not gone looking for this information. But once she had seen it, she could not unsee it. What Franklin Druce was running, behind the legitimate face of his freight company, was a smuggling operation. High-grade silver ore, pulled illegally from mining claims that should have been played out, transported under false manifests and sold privately to Aldgate, who then moved it through connections in the territorial government with no record of its origin. It was elegant in its way. It was also deeply illegal, and it implicated men with serious power and serious willingness to protect that power. Vivienne had made her first mistake the previous spring, when she had confided in a fellow clerk named Thomas Haney that something in the accounts seemed wrong. Thomas had been sympathetic and had asked several quiet questions, and had then, she realized too late, gone directly to Druce. By June, she had been dismissed from her position on invented grounds of misconduct. By August, she had received the first anonymous letter slipped under the door of her boarding room. It said only, "Stop asking questions. We know where you live." She had stopped asking questions immediately. But she had also, in a moment of what she now recognized as either bravery or complete foolishness, copied the most incriminating pages of the private ledger onto loose paper before she was dismissed. Those pages were sewn into the lining of her carpetbag. They were evidence of corruption reaching to the highest levels of the Wyoming territorial government, and they made her, by extension, a very inconvenient person to leave alive. She had been trying to get to Denver, where she knew a journalist named Lee Marsh who had written investigative pieces on territorial fraud. But her money had run out. And 2 days ago, she had seen one of Druce's men watching the street outside the boarding house. She had left in the middle of the night with her bag and her knife, and no plan beyond putting as much distance between herself and Cheyenne as possible. She had walked until her feet bled through her shoes. She had accepted a wagon ride from a farm family headed northwest, which had taken her 12 miles out of the city before they turned down a different road, and she was walking again. She had slept one night in a drainage ditch, wrapped in her coat, with the sound of coyotes threading through the dark. On the second night, half frozen and too exhausted to think straight, she had smelled hay and horses on the wind and followed that smell through a dark field to the side of a large barn, found the door unlocked, and crawled inside to sleep. She had not expected to wake up to a man sitting across from her on a feed bucket with his arms crossed, and lantern light turning his eyes the color of old whiskey. She came awake all at once, the way a person does when they are trained by fear to surface quickly from sleep. She sat up, the knife already in her hand, her back against the hay bale, her eyes scanning the space before the fog of sleep had fully cleared. He did not move. He watched her with an expression that was measured and steady and not unkind, and he raised one hand slowly, palm out, the way you might with a frightened animal. "Easy," he said. "I am not going to hurt you." She stared at him. He was tall even sitting, broad-shouldered, with the kind of lean, worked build that came from real labor rather than spectacle. He had dark brown hair, a jaw that looked like it was carved from something that did not give easily, and those calm, amber eyes that were watching her with more patience than she felt she deserved from a man whose barn she had broken into. "You found me," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep and cold. "This morning, around 4 o'clock. You were sleeping hard. I figured you needed it more than I needed to ask questions." She looked down at the blanket that had appeared over her during the night, not the thin one she had found. A thick, heavy one that smelled faintly of cedar and wool. She looked back at him. "How long have you been sitting there?" "A while," he said simply. She pulled herself to her feet, and the world tilted sideways for a moment before steadying. She pressed her hand against the hay bale. She was hungry and dehydrated, and her feet were a disaster. She was also not going to show any of that if she could help it. "I apologize for trespassing," she said. "I will be on my way." He stood up then, and he was every inch as tall as she had calculated, and he looked at her with those steady eyes and said, "Where are you going?" "That is not your concern." "It is a little below freezing outside," he said. "There is ice on the water troughs this morning. And you are standing on feet that look like they have walked about 40 miles in the wrong shoes." She stared at him. He looked back at her, not unkindly, not with pity exactly, but with a directness that was more unsettling than either of those things would have been. "I have got coffee on the stove and biscuits from last night," he said. "And I am not asking you to do anything except sit down and eat something and tell me your name. After that, if you want to leave, I will not stop you, but I would ask you to reconsider." She held his gaze for a long moment, calculating, measuring, doing what she had always done with people, looking for the hidden motive, the angle, the price she would have to pay. She did not find one, which was almost more disquieting than finding one would have been. "Vivienne," she said. "My name is Vivienne Pace." He nodded once. "Holt Oren," he said. "This is my ranch. Come have some coffee." She followed him across the yard to the house, limping more than she would have liked, clutching her carpetbag against her side. The sky was lightening in the east, a pale, cold blue-gray edging up over the mountains. The ranch spread out around her, a main house of solid timber, a bunkhouse to the west, two other outbuildings beyond the barn, fenced pastures running in all directions. It was a working cattle ranch, the kind built with years of consistent effort. There was nothing flashy about it. Everything looked like it had been built to last. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and it smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something she could not quite name but that felt, disarmingly, like a home. She sat down at the heavy kitchen table and wrapped her hands around the mug he set in front of her, and did not speak for a full minute while the warmth worked its way through her fingers. He sat down across from her with his own coffee and a plate of biscuits between them, and did not press her. She ate 2 biscuits before she said anything. Then she said, "I am not going to cause you trouble." He considered that for a moment. "Did I ask? You will want to." He turned his mug in his hands. "What kind of trouble are you talking about?" She looked at him across the table. She had a policy, born from bitter experience, of trusting no one. It had served her reasonably well. She had survived 2 months of being hunted across the Wyoming territory on the strength of that policy, and she had no good reason to abandon it now, because a man with honest eyes had given her a blanket and a biscuit. But she was so tired. She was so deeply, bone-achingly tired of carrying this alone. "The kind that involves men with guns," she said, "and the kind that involves a senator." Holt Oren looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he said, "Well, I guess you had better start at the beginning," she told him. "Not everything, not all at once, but enough." She told him about Druce and the ledgers and the silver smuggling and Senator Aldgate. She told him about Thomas Haney and the anonymous letters and the man she had seen watching the boarding house. She told him about leaving in the night and walking until she fell down and ending up in his barn. He listened without interrupting. His expression did not change much. Once, when she described the drainage ditch, something moved through his eyes that she could not fully read, but he did not say anything until she was finished. Then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You have the documents, the copies you made?" "Yes." "Where?" She put her hand on the carpetbag in her lap. He nodded. "And you were trying to get to Denver," he said. "To this journalist, to Ely Marsh. He has published pieces on territorial fraud before. He would know what to do with the evidence. But I cannot get to Denver without money, and I cannot go back to Cheyenne without being found by Druce's men." Holt turned his coffee mug again, looking at the table. "I have a ranch hand named Cal who makes the supply run to Laramie every 2 weeks," he said. "He goes again on Thursday. Laramie has a stage line. From Laramie to Denver is 2 days." She looked at him carefully. "You are offering to help me." "I am telling you what the geography looks like," he said. "Thursday is 4 days from now. If you want to stay here until Thursday and then ride with Cal to Laramie, you are welcome to do that." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because you walked 40 miles on bleeding feet to get away from men with guns, and you showed up in my barn, and I am not putting you back out there. It is as simple as that." The simplicity of it, the complete absence of calculation in his voice, was what finally cracked something open in her chest. She had been bracing for the catch, the price, the hidden motive. There was none. He meant exactly what he said. She swallowed. She looked down at her coffee. "All right," she said quietly. "Thursday." The 4 days that followed were not what she expected. She had expected to feel like a burden, a complication, a problem to be managed. She had expected to be kept at arm's length by a man who had his own work and his own life, and had taken on her situation as a practical matter. She had expected to feel like a guest, or more accurately, like a refugee tolerated out of basic human decency. Instead, she found herself folded into the life of the ranch with a naturalness that was almost confusing. Holt had 2 full-time ranch hands. Cal Denner, who was 30 and good-natured and had a laugh like a mule, and Pete Vogt, who was 54 and said very little, but could fix absolutely anything with available materials and impressive ingenuity. There was also a rotating crew of seasonal workers, but in October most of them had moved on. The ranch itself ran about 300 head of cattle, more in the summer, along with horses, chickens, and a pair of bad-tempered goats that Holt kept for reasons that were never fully explained to her. On the first morning, Vivienne borrowed a pair of thick socks from the house's linen supply and wrapped her feet and spent the day largely sitting at the kitchen table, while Holt brought her first aid supplies, and they had an argument about whether the cut at her temple needed proper cleaning, which she lost, and he cleaned it without comment and applied a poultice that smelled medicinal and worked better than she expected. On the second morning, she found that she could not simply sit. It was not in her nature. She asked Holt if she could be useful in some way while she was waiting, and he looked at her for a moment as if deciding whether to argue. And then he said that the account books for the ranch had been behind since August, and if she had any inclination toward numbers, she was welcome to look at them. She looked at them. She had them in order by noon. She found 2 arithmetic errors and a category of feed expenditure that had been misclassified for 3 years running, which was not catastrophic, but was the kind of thing that accumulated quietly into a problem. She left notes in the margins explaining each correction. When Holt came in for lunch and found her at the kitchen table surrounded by his ledgers, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the neat columns of figures, and the organized stacks of receipts, and the comprehensive summary she had written in her small, precise handwriting, and he said, "You did all of this in a morning." "The misclassification is not a disaster," she said, "but you will want to correct it going forward, especially if you are planning to expand the herd next spring." He sat down and looked at the summary for a long time. "I was planning to expand the herd next spring," he said. "Then you will need to adjust the projected feed expenditure by about 12%. He looked up at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite amusement and not quite wonder, but somewhere in the vicinity of both. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My father was a school teacher, and my mother kept the accounts for his school. I learned from her." She paused. "I had a formal education through 16, and then 2 years at a women's seminary in St. Louis before I came west." He nodded slowly. "Why did you come west?" It was a question she usually deflected. Instead, she found herself saying, "Because my parents died within 6 months of each other when I was 22, and the cousin I was going to stay with in Cheyenne had already gone to California, and I had nothing to go back to in Illinois, and everything felt like it might as well be forward." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father died 8 years ago, left me this ranch at 26. I know something about everything feeling like it might as well be forward." She looked at him across the table. Something shifted very slightly between them. A small and careful thing, like a door opening an inch on the third day. She was well enough to walk without limping, and she asked if she could see the ranch. He walked her out to the south pasture, where the cattle were grazing in the cold October sunshine, and she stood at the fence and looked out over the landscape with its high blue sky and distant mountains, and the clean, cold smell of the open land. And she thought that she had forgotten that the world could look like this, so large and clear and indifferent to human trouble. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 11 years total. Came out with my father when I was 19. We built the main house the first winter, lost the first herd in a drought, started again." He leaned on the fence beside her, his forearms resting on the top rail looking out over the pasture. "There were years when it was very hard, but you stayed." "I could not imagine leaving," he said simply. "It gets into you, this land. It is not easy, but it is honest. What you put in is what you get out. I found that I valued that." She understood it, she realized, the appeal of a thing that was honest in its demands. After 4 years of false numbers and hidden motives, and the paranoid vigilance of being a woman in a compromised position, the idea of a life that was exactly what it appeared to be was more appealing than she had words for. They stood at the fence for a long time in a silence that felt companionable rather than empty. That evening, Holt made a beef stew that was considerably better than it had any right to be, and they ate at the kitchen table, and she told him about growing up in Illinois, and he told her about his first winter on the ranch when the snow came in September, and the roof of the original bunkhouse collapsed, and they spent 4 months with all 3 men sleeping in the main house kitchen. She laughed at that genuinely, for the first time in months. It surprised her. It seemed to surprise him too, as if the sound of it lit something up in the room. She caught him watching her sometimes, not in the way that made her guard go up, but in the quiet, careful way of a person who is paying attention, who is trying to understand rather than to acquire. It was a new experience. She was not sure what to do with it. On the morning of Thursday, with Cal's wagon loaded and ready in the yard and 2 days of provisions packed, and the stage fare to Denver folded into an envelope that Holt had pressed into her hand without ceremony, she stood in the kitchen and tried to put into words what she wanted to say and found that the words were insufficient. "I will repay you," she said. "When I get to Denver and this is resolved, I will send back what you have spent." He shook his head once. "I do not need it back. You have done more for me than you were obligated to do." "I know that," he said. He looked at her steadily. "Will you write, when you get there, just to say you made it?" She heard something in the question that was more than a practical concern for her safe arrival. She felt it land in her chest and choose not to leave. "Yes," she said, "I will write." She picked up her carpetbag. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, not quite ready, and she turned back. "Holt," she said. He was standing in the kitchen with his coffee and his steady eyes and the morning light coming through the window behind him. "I think I will remember this place for the rest of my life," she said. "I want you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly. "Vivienne," he said, "come back when it's done." She went. Cal was good company on the road to Laramie. He was cheerful and asked no questions, and kept up a steady, harmless commentary on the landscape, and the quality of the road and the various failings of his cousin in Denver, whom he visited periodically. She sat on the wagon bench beside him and watched the planes roll by and kept her hand near her carpet bag, and her mind focused on the next step. She arrived in Laramie on a Thursday afternoon and booked herself a room at a clean, inexpensive boarding house recommended by Cal's cousin's neighbor's wife, which was the kind of chain of trust you learn to rely on in this part of the world. She bought a stage ticket for Saturday morning. She ate a hot meal, bathed in the washroom down the hall, and fell into the narrow boarding house bed and did not dream. On Friday morning, everything went wrong. She had come down to the boarding house parlor after breakfast, her bag in her hand, planning to walk to the dry goods store for a pair of proper boots, when the door opened and a man walked in. She recognized him. His name was Greer, and he was Franklin Druce's personal assistant, and the man she had seen watching the street in Cheyenne. He was a thin man in his late 30s with a carefully neutral expression and the particular stillness of someone who had been trained to move through spaces without disturbing them. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. For a fraction of a second, neither of them moved. Then she turned and walked quickly through the parlor to the back hallway, through the kitchen, past a startled cook, out the rear door into the alley behind the building. She did not run, not yet, because running in a public street would draw attention. She walked fast, her bag clutched to her side, her heart hammering. She went 3 blocks north, turned west, went 2 more blocks, turned into a narrow side street between a hardware store and a feed supply shop. She stopped with her back against the wall and breathed. Think, she told herself. Think carefully. Greer had found her in Laramie, which meant either that someone in Cheyenne had known she was headed this way or that Druce had men watching stage routes across the territory. Either way, she could not go back to the boarding house. She could not wait for Saturday's stage. She did not know if Greer had come alone or with others. She thought of the journalist in Denver and the evidence sewn into her bag lining and the path between here and there, and she thought of something else, some other option she had been carrying without examining, and she examined it now. She thought of Holt Oren. The ranch was 12 miles outside of Laramie on the South Road. She had come from that direction 2 days ago. She knew the road. She also knew that going back, there would bring the danger she was running from directly to his door, and she had promised herself she would not do that. She had sat at his table and eaten his food and reorganized his account books and watched him lean on the fence in the morning light and look out over his land, and she cared enough about what she had seen there to want to protect it. But she also had no other option. She bought a pair of boots from the hardware store with her last bit of cash, changed into them in the back of the store while the proprietor looked the other direction out of basic decency, and walked south out of Laramie. It took her 4.5 hours. She arrived at the ranch gate in the early afternoon, and the moment she came through the gate, she heard the kitchen door bang open, and Holt was crossing the yard toward her in 4 long strides, and he stopped when he was close enough to see her face clearly. "What happened?" he said. She told him, standing in the yard with the wind picking up and the horses restless in the corral. His expression did not change much as he listened. The jaw, the set of his eyes. He looked at her when she was finished. "You are not going back out there," he said, It was not a command exactly. It was the kind of statement that settled like a fact. "Holt," she said, "if I stay here it puts you in danger. Druce's men are looking for me. They will come here eventually." "Then we will deal with that when they come," he said. "You do not understand what these people are capable of." "I understand more than you think." He looked at her steadily. "Vivienne, you have evidence of federal fraud and you have people willing to kill to suppress it. You cannot outrun that on your own across open country. You need somewhere to be while we find a better way to get that evidence where it needs to go." She stared at him. "What better way?" "I know the federal marshal in Laramie," he said. "His name is Garfield Clay. I have known him for 7 years. He is not connected to the territorial government and he has no reason to protect Aldgate." She felt her heart rate shift. "A marshal," she said slowly. "If we could get the evidence to a federal marshal rather than a journalist, the legal protection would be stronger." "That was my thinking." She looked at him. She thought about the 8-week chain of lonely and terrified decisions that had brought her here, and she thought about how, against all odds, the safest place she had been in all of that time was standing in a yard in Wyoming talking to a man named Holt Orrin. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" That evening, Holt rode into Laramie alone. He found Marshal Clay at the office on 2nd Street, where he usually was in the late afternoon, and he closed the door behind him and sat down across the marshal's desk and said, "Garfield, I have something that needs your full attention and your absolute discretion, and I need to know right now whether I have both." Marshal Clay was a heavy-set man of 50 with a gray mustache and the measured, careful manner of someone who had spent decades listening before speaking. He folded his hands on the desk. "You have never asked me for anything in 11 years, he said. "So yes, talk." Holt laid it out. He told the marshal about Vivienne, and the ledger copies, and the freight company, and Senator Aldgate, and the smuggling operation. He described Greer and what had happened in Laramie that morning. The marshal listened without expression until Holt finished. Then he was quiet for a full minute, which was, Holt knew from experience, what Garfield Clay did when he was thinking through something with genuine seriousness. "Corbin Aldgate," the marshal said finally, "you know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying." "This woman has copies of the private ledgers. You have seen them." "No, but I have seen her and I believe her." The marshal looked at him. "You believe her," he said. "Yes." The marshal was quiet again for a moment. "Bring her in tomorrow morning, early before the town wakes up. We will look at what she has and go from there." Holt rode back to the ranch in the dark. When he came in through the kitchen door, Vivienne was at the table with a cup of tea and his ranch account book still open in front of her, though she did not appear to be reading them. She looked up when he came in, and he saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. "Clay will see us tomorrow morning," he said. "Early." She let out a breath that she seemed to have been holding since he left. "Does he believe it's credible?" she asked. "He will when he sees the documents." Holt hung his coat on the peg and came to the table and poured himself coffee. "He is a careful man. That is a good thing in this situation." She nodded. Then she said, "Thank you for all of this. You did not have to go to him. You did not have to do any of this." He sat down across from her. He looked at her in the lamplight, with her dark hair loose and her eyes that he had been cataloging for days now, gray-green and very direct, the kind of eyes that saw everything they looked at. "I told you," he said. "You are not going back out there alone." She looked at him across the table, and something passed between them in that long moment that was more than gratitude and more than simple human concern for a stranger in trouble. She felt it clearly. She suspected he did too. She said, "You are a very stubborn man." "I have been told that," he said. And the corner of his mouth moved, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face in a way that made her chest do something complicated. She looked down at her tea. That night, lying in the small spare room that she had been sleeping in since the first morning, she lay awake a long time looking at the ceiling and listening to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the timbers, the distant sound of the cattle, the wind against the window glass. She thought about her life in its current state and what it might look like when this was over. She thought about Lee Marsh in Denver and whether she would still go there when the marshal had the evidence. She thought about the address she could write to when this was resolved. A ranch 12 miles south of Laramie with the mountains in the west. She thought about a man with amber eyes who sat on a feed bucket in a dark barn for 3 hours because he wanted to be sure she was safe when she woke up. She closed her eyes. In the morning, they were up before dawn. Vivienne dressed carefully and tucked the copied ledger pages into her bag, and they rode together on horseback to Laramie, arriving as the first gray light was touching the tops of the buildings, and the streets were nearly empty. Marshal Clay was already at his office with the lamp on, which meant he had been thinking about this too. He shook Holt's hand and looked at Vivienne with the careful, assessing gaze of a man who spent his professional life judging whether people were telling the truth. "Miss Pace," he said, "sit down and show me what you have." She laid the copied pages on his desk. She explained the system, the double ledger structure, the shipping manifest discrepancies, the coded references to Aldgate, and the transactions that matched no legitimate business activity. She was thorough and she was precise, and she did not editorialize. She let the numbers speak. Clay read everything 3 times. He asked 22 questions, which she counted, and she answered all of them clearly. He sent his deputy, a young man named Ira, out to get a second lamp. Finally, he sat back in his chair and looked at Holt. "This is the real thing," he said. "This is not territory level. This is federal." "That is what I thought," Holt said. "I need to send a telegraph to the federal district office in Denver today. I also need you, Miss Pace, to write a signed statement detailing your account." He looked at her directly. "And I need you to stay accessible while this moves forward. Where are you staying?" "She is staying at my ranch," Holt said. Vivienne glanced at him. He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at the marshal. Clay looked between them for a moment and then said, "All right. Keep her out of sight in Laramie until we know whether Druce's man is still in town. I will send word when I have heard back from Denver." They rode back to the ranch as the town was waking up behind them, the streets filling slowly with the early morning sounds of a frontier town getting underway. Vivienne rode beside Holt and thought about what he had said. "She is staying at my ranch." The certainty of it. The complete absence of hesitation. "You said that as if it was decided," she said. "It is decided," he said. "By whom?" He looked at her sideways from beneath the brim of his hat. "I figured you would tell me if it wasn't." She considered that for a moment, then she said, "I am not arguing." The ghost of that almost smile again. They rode back through the morning, the mountains ice bright in the west, the sky the deep clear blue of high Wyoming autumn, and something between them had shifted very slightly in the direction of something neither of them had named yet. The telegraph from Denver came back within 3 days. The federal district office confirmed that the matter was being taken seriously. A federal agent named Prescott was being dispatched from Denver to Laramie to collect the evidence and take Vivienne's formal deposition. He was expected within the week. They also confirmed, through a contact Clay had in the territorial capital, that Senator Aldgate had become aware that there was some kind of investigation moving and was applying pressure through the territorial channels to have it suppressed. This meant that time was a factor, and it also meant that Franklin Druce had been told, because 2 days after the marshal's telegraph, Greer came to the ranch. He came in the late afternoon with another man, a heavy-set man named Collies that Vivienne recognized from the Druce freight yard, and they rode up to the main gate on horseback and hailed the house. Holt came out on the porch. Vivienne watched from the kitchen window with her heart in her throat. Greer asked for Vivienne Pace. He was polite about it. He said she had left some personal effects at a boarding house in Laramie, and he had been sent to return them, which was an obvious fabrication but a carefully constructed one. Holt leaned on the porch post with his arms crossed and looked at Greer for a long, level moment. "No one here by that name," he said. Greer looked at the house. He looked back at Holt. "We were told she might be in this area," he said. "Whoever told you that was mistaken," Holt said. "This is private property. You are welcome to turn around and ride back the way you came." Something cold moved through Greer's expression. He did not believe it, but he also looked at Holt Oren standing on his porch, steady as the fence posts around him, and he made a calculation. "We will be back," he said. "You are welcome to come back with a legal reason to be here," Holt said. "Until then." He stood on the porch and watched them ride away without moving. When they were out of sight, he came back inside, and Vivienne was already at the kitchen door, and they nearly collided in the doorway. "They will be back," she said. "I know, with more men, probably." He stepped past her into the kitchen. "I need to send word to Cal and Pete. And I need to send a message to Clay that Greer has been here." "Holt." She caught his arm without thinking. He stopped and looked down at her. "I am sorry. I brought this here. This is not what I wanted." He looked at her hand on his arm and then up at her face. His expression was not angry. It was something else, something quieter and more complicated. "Vivienne," he said. "Stop apologizing for being in trouble you did not create." She let go of his arm. She looked up at him. "He will use force," she said. "Druce is willing to use force. He has done it before." "I know." He held her gaze. "I have Cal and Pete, and I have been on this land for 11 years. I am not afraid of Franklin Druce's hired men. I am afraid for you." The words came out before she had decided to say them. They hung between them in the kitchen. Holt looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his eyes. Something that had been held carefully in place began, very slowly, to move. "That is the first time you have said something like that to me," he said. "I know," she said quietly. He reached up slowly and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so simple and so careful that it felt more significant than anything elaborate could have. His fingers barely grazed her cheek. "I will be careful," he said. "And when this is over, we are going to have a very different kind of conversation." She felt the weight of that promise settle somewhere deep. "All right," she said softly. He sent messages to Clay and to his ranch hands, and that night there were 2 more men at the ranch. Pete and Cal sleeping in the main house rather than the bunkhouse, and Holt's rifle propped by the front door and a second one behind the kitchen counter. It felt, Vivienne thought, like holding your breath. They came the next evening just before dark. There were 4 of them this time. Greer and Collies and 2 men she did not recognize, all 4 on horseback, coming through the front gate without hailing the house. It was Cal who saw them first from the water tower he had climbed to mend a leak, and he called out, and Holt was on the porch in 60 seconds with the rifle in his hand. Vivienne stayed inside as Holt had asked her to. She watched from the window with her fists clenched at her sides. Greer pulled up in the yard and looked at Holt with the rifle and the 2 ranch hands flanking him, and he said that he needed Miss Pace to come with him, and that this did not have to be complicated. Holt said, "There is a federal agent arriving in Laramie within the next 2 days. The evidence is already in the marshal's possession. Whatever you think you are going to accomplish by being here, you are wrong." That was not what Greer expected. The carefully neutral expression flickered. "You are making a significant mistake," Greer said. I make very few mistakes on my own land, Holt said, and then the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses coming fast up the south road. Everyone turned. Coming through the gate was Marshal Garfield Clay with 3 deputies, and a man in a dark coat who turned out to be the federal agent, Prescott, who had arrived in Laramie 2 days earlier than expected. Greer looked at the marshal. He looked at the federal agent's badge. He looked at the assembled men with their rifles. He looked at Holt Oren standing on the porch with his expression like carved stone. He was a man who made calculations for a living. He made this one quickly. He and his men submitted without further argument. Greer was taken into custody on charges that Prescott listed in a clipped official voice. The other 3 men were held pending further questioning. Nobody fired a weapon. Nobody was hurt. It was, Vivienne thought watching through the window, both anticlimactic and deeply satisfying. When she came out onto the porch, Prescott turned to her with the careful deference of someone who understood that she was the reason he was here. Miss Pace, he said, we have a great deal to discuss. The next 3 days were consumed by formal process. Vivienne gave her deposition to Prescott twice, once informally and once in the formal written record. Marshal Clay sat in on both. The copied ledger pages were taken into federal custody, cataloged, and confirmed as authentic by a document examiner who arrived from Denver on the stage. Prescott was a businesslike man of 45 who told her, with the unvarnished directness she appreciated, that the case against Druce and Aldgate was strong, that Aldgate would attempt to use his political connections to slow the process, that it would likely be 6 months to a year before the legal proceedings were resolved, and that her safety during that time was a federal concern. He also told her that with the evidence secured, she was no longer in immediate danger. Greer and his associates being in custody eliminated the direct threat. Druce would be arrested within the week. Aldgate would be notified of the investigation, and his political career would effectively be destroyed before the legal proceedings began, because these things moved through the newspapers regardless of what the courts did. She walked back from the marshal's office to where Holt was waiting with the horses, and the afternoon sun was low and golden over Laramie, and she stopped beside him and said, "It is done, or the beginning of done at any rate." He looked at her. He had been patient and steady through all of it, through the tension and the waiting and the armed men in the yard, and he was patient and steady now. But she could see something underneath that steadiness that had been building since the first morning in his kitchen. "Then come home," he said. She felt the words settle over her like the cedar and wool blanket he had placed over her in the barn. Home. She rode back to the ranch beside him in the late golden afternoon, and did not say anything for a long time, because she was too busy feeling the truth of something she had been carefully refusing to articulate. She was in love with him. She had been in love with him since at least the fence post conversation on the second day, and possibly since the moment she woke up to find a warm blanket laid over her by a man who had sat up most of the night on a feed bucket to make sure she was safe. She had been resisting it because she was a practical woman in a dangerous situation with no fixed address and no immediate future, and it had seemed like a pointless extravagance to feel it. But the situation was resolved, and she felt it. She had no idea what to do with that. That evening, Holt made dinner again, a roasted chicken this time with potatoes, and something involving wild sage that should not have worked as well as it did. Cal and Pete ate with them, and the table was lively in a way she had come to love, with Cal's outsized laugh and Pete's dry observations, and the easy rhythm of people who knew each other well and were glad of each other's company. After dinner, Cal and Pete went to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet with the lamp burning low and the sound of the wind outside. Holt was washing the dishes. Vivienne stood beside him drying them, which had become, without any formal arrangement, her contribution to the evening routine over the past week. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then Holt said, without turning from the basin, "Are you going to Denver?" She took her time with the plate in her hands. "Prescott does not need me there," she said. "The evidence is with the federal office and my deposition is recorded. My physical presence in Denver is not required." He was quiet. She could see the line of his jaw. "That is not quite what I asked," he said. She set the plate down. She turned toward him. He was still looking at the basin, his hands in the soapy water, and she said, "Holt, look at me." He turned. He dried his hands on the towel hanging from the hook beside the basin, and he looked at her. And there it was. Everything she had been watching move slowly through him for the past week and a half. The steadiness and the care and the thing underneath both of those that was more than practical concern for a stranger's safety. "I was told to come back when it was done," she said. "I am here." Something shifted in his expression, the careful control of it, the deliberate patience softening into something else. "Vivienne," he said. "I do not want to go to Denver," she said. "I want to stay here. If that is something you are willing to consider." He crossed the small distance between them in one step, and he put his hand against her jaw, gentle and steady, tilting her face up, and he looked at her for a long, suspended moment that felt like the held breath before a door opens. "I have wanted to do this since the second morning," he said. "When you handed me those account corrections and looked at me like it was nothing, and I thought that I had never seen anything like you." She put her hand over his. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that had been held in careful check for 10 days and knew exactly what it was, warm and deliberate and deeply certain of itself. She kissed him back with the same certainty, with everything she had been holding back, and it tasted like coming in from cold weather. When they pulled apart, she was very slightly breathless. He looked at her with those amber eyes and said, "Stay." She put both her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms, faster than his steady exterior would have suggested. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." They stood together in the kitchen in the lamplight for a long time after that, not talking much, not needing to. She leaned against his shoulder and he rested his chin on her hair, and the ranch settled around them in its familiar nighttime sounds, and it felt, for the first time in years, like she was standing in a place that was hers. The weeks that followed were the best of her life, and also the busiest. There was practical work to be done. The kind of practical work that comes when two people decide to build something together from a foundation that is already established, but needs to be expanded. Vivienne had been sleeping in the spare room, and after 2 weeks, it became quietly clear to both of them that this was a temporary arrangement with a definite direction. They talked about it plainly, the way two practical people who were also deeply in love talked about things, and they agreed that they wanted to do this properly. "I would like to marry you," Holt said one morning over coffee, setting the mug down and looking at her with the directness that she had come to love about him. She looked back at him. "You would like to?" "I would like to very much," he said, "if you are agreeable." "I am agreeable," she said. "I am, in fact, more than agreeable." He smiled at that, the full version, the one she had been working to earn since the first day, and it was worth every bit of the effort. They married in November, at the small church in Laramie, with Cal and Pete as witnesses and Marshall Clay in the second pew, and a handful of neighboring ranch families who had come to know Holt over the years. Vivienne wore a dark blue dress that she had made from fabric bought at the dry goods store, and she carried a small bunch of late-blooming prairie flowers that Cal had found somewhere with characteristic goodwill. She had no family there. That was a grief she sat with honestly. The parents who had died too soon, the cousin who had gone to California, the years of solitary navigation. But when she stood at the front of that small church and looked at Holt standing solid and serious, and then smiling at her, the quiet grief was met and answered by something much larger. She was not alone anymore. Winter came down hard in December, the way Wyoming winters did, without apology and without relenting. The ranch settled into its cold weather rhythms, the cattle brought to lower pasture, the water troughs kept clear of ice, the long evenings by the stove with books and lamp-lit conversation. Vivienne took over the ranch accounts formally, which freed up considerable time and mental energy for Holt, and added an organized financial structure to the operation that none of them had had the specific skill to build before. She began corresponding with Prescott in Denver, who sent her periodic updates on the case. Druce had been charged. Aldgate had resigned from the Senate in advance of the formal indictment. Several of his associates in the territorial government were under investigation. The machine was coming apart under its own exposed weight. She wrote a long letter to Ellie Marsh in Denver, not the one she had planned to write, the urgent, frightened letter of a woman with evidence and nowhere safe to be, but a different kind. She told him how the story had resolved. She told him about Marshall Clay and Prescott and the federal case. She told him she was well and settled and did not need anything from him. He wrote back and said the story had broken in the Denver papers through the federal office's own announcement, and that Aldgate's resignation had caused a political earthquake that would reshape the territory for years. He said she should be proud of herself. She sat with that letter for a while. She had not thought of it as being proud of herself. She had thought of it as surviving, and then as finding her way through, and now as building something with the man she had found on the other side of it. But she supposed Ellie Marsh was not entirely wrong. In February, she realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling Holt, not because she was uncertain about the welcome it would receive, but because she wanted to simply sit with it privately for a little while, the profound quiet of knowing that something new was coming into the world because of them. She told him on a Sunday evening after dinner, and the expression that moved through his face was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human being. He crossed the kitchen in one stride and held her face in his hands and looked at her as if he were seeing something he had not quite dared to imagine. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am very well," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers and his hands were not quite steady. "We are going to need a bigger table," he said into her hair. She laughed, and he held her, and outside the Wyoming winter pressed against the windows, and inside the kitchen was warm and everything was exactly right. Their son was born in October, almost exactly 1 year after Vivienne had crawled into Holt's barn and fallen asleep in the hay. They named him James, after Holt's father, and he came into the world with considerable opinions about the process, and made them known from the first breath. He had Holt's dark hair and Vivienne's gray-green eyes, and absolutely no patience for being put down once he was picked up, which Cal, who became the child's most devoted admirer by the second week, called a personality of significant ambition. The birth was attended by a midwife from Laramie named Mrs. Holloway, who arrived 2 hours before she was needed and stayed for 2 days after, which turned out to be the right call in both directions. Holt spent the labor pacing the hallway in a manner that Vivienne found both endearing and mildly entertaining, and when Mrs. Holloway finally called him in and he saw his son for the first time, he sat down in the chair beside the bed and held the baby with the careful, exact grip of a man who understood that some things required absolute precision, and did not say anything at all for a long time. He looked up eventually and found Vivienne watching him, and she smiled. "Hello," she said quietly. "Hello," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. He reached across with his free hand and found hers on the bed and held on. The legal proceedings against Druce concluded the following spring with a conviction on 11 counts of fraud and conspiracy. Aldgate was convicted on 7 counts and sentenced to 5 years in the federal penitentiary, a verdict that sent a visible wave through the territorial political establishment and was reported in every major newspaper from Denver to Chicago. Prescott sent Vivienne a letter of formal thanks from the federal district office, which she read at the kitchen table with James on her knee, and then folded carefully and put in the small cedar box where she kept the things that mattered. She had been offered a formal consulting position with the federal district office, reviewing financial documents in suspected fraud cases. The work could be done largely through correspondence, with occasional trips to Denver. She talked it over with Holt for 3 evenings, going through the practical aspects and the less practical ones, and he listened as he always did, and then said what he always said in one form or another, which was that she should do the thing she believed in, and he would support whatever that looked like. She took the position. Over the next several years, the ranch grew. Holt expanded the herd as planned, and the careful financial management meant the expansion happened at a sustainable pace without the cash flow problems that undid many similar operations. Vivienne's consulting work brought in additional income that went into land improvement. A new well, better fencing for the south pasture, eventually a real schoolroom built onto the east side of the house, when it became clear that they would have children to educate. That became relevant in the autumn of their 3rd year together, when their 2nd child arrived. A girl this time, named Ruth, who came into the world considerably more efficiently than James had, and spent the first few months looking at everyone with an expression of calm and penetrating assessment that made Holt say she had her mother's eyes in more ways than one. Cal got married in the spring of that same year, to a woman named Mary Denner from Laramie, who had a talent for bread and an absolutely no-nonsense approach to the world that complemented Cal's cheerful expansiveness perfectly. They built a small house on the southwest corner of the ranch property, and the table that needed to be bigger expanded to accommodate more people most Sunday evenings. Pete Vogt retired officially at 58 but remained on the property because, as he said without particular sentiment, he had nowhere else to be and things kept needing to be fixed. He built James a rocking horse that winter and pretended it was a leftover piece of wood that needed using up. Marshall Clay retired the year James turned 3 and moved to Laramie's quieter side to grow a vegetable garden, which he had apparently always wanted to do. He came out to the ranch for dinner periodically and watched the children with the expression of a man who felt that the world had arranged itself correctly. Vivienne wrote a long personal account of the events of 1882, the fraud, the flight, the evidence, the resolution, at the request of an editor in Denver who was putting together a record of significant cases in the early territorial period. She wrote it carefully and honestly, including the drainage ditch and the 40 miles on bad shoes in the barn. And when she read it back, she found that the story she had been living through, which had felt in its worst moments like a trap, like a dark past catching her no matter how fast she moved, had become in retrospect something else. It had become the path that brought her here. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a December evening 5 years after their marriage when Holt came in from the cold and stomped his boots at the door and saw her reading the account over for the last time before she sent it. She looked up at him. "I am trying to decide how to end it," she said. He came to look over her shoulder, scanning the last paragraph, and he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to say?" he asked. She thought about it. She thought about a woman who had been alone and frightened and carrying something too heavy to carry alone, who had walked through the cold Wyoming night following the smell of hay and horses, and had found, in a barn in the dark, the beginning of something she had not known to look for. "I want to say that the worst roads sometimes lead to the best places," she said. "If you keep walking." He put his hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. "That is true," he said. "Finish it." She finished it. Outside, the December cold had its grip on the Wyoming night, and the mountains were white, and the ranch was still with the specific, deep quiet of a place that had been worked well and would be worked well again in the morning. The house was warm. From down the hall came the sound of two children sleeping, the breathed, innocent sound of total peace. Holt poured coffee for both of them and sat down across from her at the big table and picked up the newspaper. And she sealed the envelope and wrote the address and set it aside for the morning post. And they were quiet together in the comfortable, inhabited way of people who have built something real together and know it. She looked at him over the lamp, at the familiar lines of his face, the jaw that did not give easily, the amber eyes that looked up from the paper and found hers and held them. "Thank you," she said. He set the paper down. "For what?" he asked. "For the blanket," she said. "That first night. For sitting on that feed bucket." He looked at her across the table, and his expression did the thing it did sometimes that she had never been able to fully describe, that quality of absolute attention, of being the only thing in the world he was looking at. "You were sleeping in my barn," he said. "What else was I going to do?" She smiled. "You could have sent me away," she said. "No," he said simply. "I could not have." She reached across the table and her hand found his. "I know," she said. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed on, cold and enormous and indifferent to human concern, the way it always had and always would. And inside the house, 12 miles south of Laramie, in a kitchen lit by a single lamp, a man and a woman held hands across a table and listened to their children sleep. And the life they had built together was exactly what it looked like, which was everything. Spring came early the year James turned 6 and Ruth turned 3. A soft, wet spring that turned the south pasture green in early April and made the cattle restless, and the horses excited, and made even Pete Vogt say, without preamble, while fixing the hinge on the bunkhouse door, that it was a fine season. Holt had been talking for 2 years about adding a second barn to the north side of the property, and that spring was when they finally did it. It was a significant project, 3 weeks of work with extra hands brought in, and Vivienne found herself in the position she had been in so many times before, managing the accounts and the supply orders and the scheduling with the focused efficiency that came naturally to her, but also just being present, bringing coffee out in the afternoons, watching the structure go up beam by beam. On the day they raised the main frame, all the hands on the property came to help, because a frame raising was still a communal event even on a private ranch, and Mary Denner brought food, and the children ran around the periphery with the controlled chaos of small people who sense something significant is happening and want to be near it. Vivienne stood beside Holt as the last beam settled into place and the structure stood, rough framed and solid against the blue sky, and the men let out the collective sound that people let out when a heavy thing goes right. She said, "That is a fine barn." He looked at it with the specific satisfaction of a man who builds things that last. "It is," he said. Then he looked at her sideways, and the almost smile was there, the one she had been earning variations of for 5 years. "The first one changed my life," he said. "I expect good things from this one." She laughed and put her arm through his and leaned against his shoulder. The first barn stood exactly as it had always stood, on the south side of the yard, its weathered timber and solid frame unchanged, since the morning Vivienne Pace had crawled through its door and fallen asleep in the hay. It had been painted once, a deep red, the previous autumn, and it caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look like something out of a painting. Sometimes in the evenings, when the children were inside and the ranch was quiet, Vivienne walked past it and thought about that night. The cold and the dark and the terrible exhausted relief of finding shelter, the knife still in her hand even in sleep. The lantern light, a man she had not known yet, sitting on a feed bucket in the dark. She had been running from one thing and had arrived, without planning it, at everything she needed. James, at 6, had discovered that the barn was the finest place on the property for the specific childhood project of hiding, which he pursued with serious dedication. Holt found him there one afternoon, wedged between two hay bales with a small wooden horse he had been secretly constructing out of fence scraps, and he sat down beside him in the hay and asked him what he was building, and James explained it at considerable length. Holt came inside that evening and told Vivienne about it, and she looked up from her consulting papers with a smile that started small and grew. "It appears our barn has something of a tradition," she said. He sat down across from her, and his face was the open, honest face of a man who had made all the right choices and knew it. "It appears it does," he said. Outside, the Wyoming evening was long and golden in the way of early summer, the light going slowly over the mountains, the cattle settled in the pasture, the new barn standing alongside the old one, the whole of the place looking like what it was, home. A real one, built by hand and decision, and the particular kind of love that comes not from perfect circumstances but from choosing again and again, even when it costs something, even when the road was hard and uncertain and the weather was against you, choosing the person, choosing to stay, choosing to open the door. She was finishing her correspondence when she heard Holt's step on the porch, and then the kitchen door, and then his hands on her shoulders from behind, warm and certain. She reached up and put her hands over his. They stayed like that for a moment, in the last light of a good day, at the table of their shared life. Then James called from somewhere in the house, that particular carrying call of a 6-year-old who has found something interesting and requires immediate witnesses. And Ruth's voice answered him from another direction with the somewhat bossier tone of a 3-year-old who intends to be involved in everything. And Holt lifted his hands from Vivienne's shoulders and said, "I will go," and she said, "Thank you," and listened to his footsteps going down the hall toward the noise. She sat for a moment longer at the kitchen table. She thought about a cold October night and a lantern in a doorway and a man who had made a decision before he knew her name. She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly and not sent away. She picked up her pen. She continued her work. And the ranch turned, as ranches do, through its seasons, and the mountains stayed where they had always been, and the life that had been built inside its fences was full and warm and real. It was exactly in every way enough.